In a lot of ways, Isao Takahata is the opposite to Miyazaki. He'd walk into work seconds from being late with a piece of bread in his mouth and tap water in hand. He's the kind of guy who'd wander off in his own world if you didn't keep an eye on him. You'd later find him taking a nap, clasping a half-open pack of cigarettes. That's not to discredit Isao. His films have a level of pristine you can only get from breaking all your deadlines. Which is funny considering Takahata fell into the animation business. He was a graduate of French literature. Granted, through this degree, he was introduced to Mr. Wonderbird, the film that instilled within him a fascination towards animation, leading to Isao's application to Toei Doga, where he became an assistant director, gaining the respect of his peers, including one in particular that Isao met through his involvement in the labor union, Mr. Hayao Miyazaki, who'd soon become his partner in crime. One day, Yasao Otsuka gave Isao a shot at making a name for himself as a director. With big aspirations, Takahata and his team planned to change the game at Toei. What they delivered was a critically acclaimed classic, where even I've sang the praise of it on at least one occasion. Reflecting on the student rebellion mentality of the 60s, socialist themes on collectivism, as well as one of the most complex female characters of the era, Hilda. So would this be the film that brought Isao to prominence, winning him the respect of the whole industry? Not a chance. Horus Prince of the Sun went through a production hell exceeding its budget and bombed. Toei ostracized Takahata, sending him back to assistant directing until he left altogether. As tensions would rise, Miyazaki followed. In 1971, there was an opportunity in Stockholm. The boys were in talks at A Productions to adapt a famous Swedish tale, Pippi Longstockings. Takahata had described Pippi as a bomb that freed children's minds to be just as they were. This being a dream job for both of them, Miyazaki even travelled to Europe to delegate the terms, doing research on the way. They had a team back in Japan with Yoichi Kotabe and Yasao Otsuka in pre-production, creating character designs, layouts, and concept art. This could be Takahata's redemption project, if it were ever greenlit. The author refused the proposal for whatever reason. All that work was for nothing. Until Takahata pitched they reused the concept for a new piece that preyed on the panda boom in Japan at the time. They take the failure of Pippi Longstockings and turn it into a short film, Go Panda Go. Deeming children's entertainment too loud and flashy, Takahata and the gang wanted to make something slower paced and more intimate. This began Isao's flirtation with the slice-of-life genre. While serene, Panda could also be wacky with its nonsensical premise, a panda dad and son becoming Mimako's surrogate family. This only gets more extreme by the second short. While the shorts themselves were well put together, they might be more interesting in retrospect for what they inspired further down the line, as concepts from Panda Go Panda were expanded upon, revisited, like in Takahata's next project, Heidi. Based on the Swiss novel of the same name, Isao saw Heidi's life as the perfect childhood in comparison to his war-torn one, making her story something he'd be happy to immerse in, as he takes ideas from Panda but with a more grounded focus on the intricate movements of the characters, bringing life to Takahata's objective realism philosophy. Inspired by Italian neorealists, French New Wave, Ozu, the list goes on. All that focus on the reality of interpersonal relationships. Isao's characters aren't vessels for the audience, they are pulled back, imperfect, sometimes troubled people. Takahata compares this process to making a documentary, trying not to insert any scene that would make it feel fake. Heidi does this by creating a rhythm for the character's everyday schedule, so when there is the occasional tense moment or human drama, it draws you in. For the 70s anime, working within the limitations of TV, it not only pushed the medium further, but gave a satisfying adaptation of the source material. Now this must be Isao's retribution for his team's dedication. Well, of course not. While Heidi was a huge worldwide success, the only reward the team got was apathy as the production tanked the studio, leading to its complete restructure. Yet, Heidi is still considered a classic in Japan, with Hayao saying it's one of his favourites from Takahata. Now, Heidi may not be a complete success for the time, but the ratings were good enough to spawn a new movement in anime, world masterpiece theatre. Takahata would continue working on these shows for the rest of the 70s, working next on 3,000 Leagues in Search of Mother, which was a bit more dour in comparison to Heidi, then moving between shows until Miyazaki and Takahata's team play lessened. Hayao wanted to prove himself as an individual director, starting with Future Boy Conan, although Isao would help on the show from time to time, directing episodes and storyboarding here and there. Even if he wasn't part of the creative process, you can tell where his prior work inspired the show, as Conan incorporates story beats from Horace, as well as entire sequences. The split between them would go on to define the styles of content they'd produce for the rest of their careers. Miyazaki's more fantastical worlds, where Isao kept everything small and personal, like in Anne of Green Gables. The last world masterpiece theatre project Isao would direct, having a refined visual flair thanks to the talents of Yoshifumi Kondo, who worked on the animation and character designs. For Isao's next project, he'd approach something different, based in Japan, Osaka to be exact, known as Chi the Brat, but in the West it's called Downtown Story. This is one of the few times I prefer the English title. The film focuses on Chi's malfunctioning family life. However, as it goes, the focus becomes less about that and more on the wider net of friends and family, how their relationships change over the day-to-day experience. It's the story of the town, which is what drew Takahata in, its earnestness to portray the Osaka lifestyle. He does a great job of capturing those characters' unpredictable nature. As you watch the story unfold, it turns into something you wouldn't expect, and as a comedy, it's cruder than Takahata's previous work, slapstick and silly, which is refreshing to see after all the grandeur. I'd call it a highlight from him, one that isn't talked about as much, even if it had a mild obsession with animal testicles, which we may see a surprise return a little bit later on. Goosh the Celloist. This project speaks to Isao's passion taking 6 years to make, where he had continued to develop on that lucid world, seen in the World Masterpiece Theatre output, or as early as Horace. This hits a new level in Goosh. It can be surreal, letting the emotions of the scene take over in its visual style, the musical aspect flowing with the animation, using Mickey Mousing as a technique, where the character's movement follows the audio, while keeping true to the character's minute routine, telling you a lot about them without having to say a word. With the process slowly opening up Goosh as a character, learning how to express himself through the medium of music. While The Celloist was well received, it wasn't making waves with the public. I can't even buy an English copy anywhere, though there are some regional locked Blu-rays around if you know where to look. The mid-80s was a transition point for Isao. He had developed an unfinished version of Little Nemo, which I made a video about here, before founding Ghibli, where he'd stay for the rest of his career. At Ghibli, his first project was not Grave of the Fireflies, as most might think, but in fact a documentary on the story of the Yanagawa canals. Isao went out on a research project for an untitled Ghibli film, but instead, he became so invested in the story of the town and the canals, he ended up making a 3-hour documentary funded by the profits of Nausicaa. You can feel the freewheeling approach of Isao's wandering personality, as well as his passion for his own country's history. Every film he would make at Ghibli after would be distinctly Japanese. Perhaps it's too long and indulgent, or specific for a wide audience. Though in that mentality, Takahata seems relieved, as to say, I don't need to worry about making films as commercial because we have a Miyazaki. This seems to give him the freedom to mess around, which is evident in his career at Ghibli, or in the fact that he would go out of his way to make a film so far out of his comfort zone. Grave of the Fireflies. Now this is one exception to the rule. Grave of the Fireflies did well overseas eventually. It's rated the 4th highest animated film on IMDb, and has gained quite the reputation as one of the best animated movies ever made. In Japan, it's played on the TV every year at the end of the war anniversary, as well as in schools, as part of their studies. So yeah, it left an impact. So may I ask this one, is this one Takahata film which needs further re-examining? First off, credit to Takahata. This is his most polished film yet. The animation is always on point, fluid and naturalistic. Even if it was a bit slapdash, they had to sneak into the theatre to add in the final frames to the celluloid reel during its debuts. The direction is solid, though where issues start to seep in is more towards the characters. It's a step down from what came before. As a post-war kid who experienced bombing firsthand, the story of Grave of Fireflies must have resonated with Takahata. Some of the best scenes in the films happen at the start, when the town is incendiary bombed, something Takahata experienced firsthand. However, The stilted character interactions afterwards come off a bit like Oscar bait. Saito never gets frustrated with his sister and rarely lets down his facade in a typical stoic Japanese persona, even as his mother dies. In the bleak moments afterwards, he's trying to do tricks to calm down his crying sister as the violins swell. The whole scene feels constructed to be emotional. The award nominations rising with the orchestra. Most of the sibling scenes do paint the wanderlust of youth, naivete, to build a sadder conclusion. Yet, when compared to other war films like Barefoot Gen, Graves' childhood feels inauthentic. In his defense, I will say Setsuko's portrayal is much better than the other characters. In the Japanese dub, they were able to get a real 4-year-old to play the role, and her actions and performance ring true. Without this performance, the basis of the film would crumble, but we'll get to that. The aunt is a little bit one note, but my biggest problem with the characters is more so Saito. He's a stiff protagonist whose unwavering decisions led to extremity. Despite the fact he was living a stone throw away from his aunt, he never reconsidered going back and asking for forgiveness, even when it's brought up within the narrative. How he's willing to steal from others when there are other options. He never attempts to find a real job, and after the doctor told him about his sister's condition, he still wouldn't reconsider. It all leaves you frustrated with the character. However, I'd contest, as frustrating as it is, to watch Saito makes these poor decisions. He's still a child on the cusp of adulthood. His decisions are mimicking adults following that Bushido-like code, and that was his undoing. And while Saito could have made the decisions that led to his salvation, it is ultimately a damning statement on the adults in the film that despite knowing Saito's intentions, location, and issues, they stood idle, unwilling to budge, as it was more convenient to do nothing. Some may argue Saito's actions are based in an autobiographical sense, so they can't necessarily be criticised in that way. Though I hate to tell you, Grave of the Fireflies is a lie. It's a romanticisation of events that were not as poetic, where the author ate and his sister starved, having to live with that guilt for the rest of his life. It's a real story of tragedy and pathos. Profiting off that tragedy and turning it into a double suicide play is a bit tasteless in my eyes, but that's his trauma, he can do as he may with it. He mentioned in the novella that it was created to honour his sister's life, although there are some comments he's made which make me wonder about that. Yeah.
Get off me, Satan.
There are some readings of the film that would argue Saito's actions were a criticism on the Japanese blind patriotism. Yet several incidents in the film contradict this. Saito does talk about his father in great admiration, that he can shoot down the bad people, although as a character he's presented as unpatriotic by his aunt and others for not doing his part to help, along with his willingness to steal from his countrymen during bombings, distancing himself from others to live in a fantasy land to the point he doesn't even know the war is over. That blind patriotism, in this case, is more just an admiration for his own father, bringing me to conclude that this film is more to do with the themes of fleeting youth than the war itself. Saito's actions were cited by Takahata as making a movie that would take a kid of today and put them back into the past, into this sort of World War II situation. It wasn't supposed to be retrospective or nostalgic. But this is where I started to take some umbrage with Takahata's decision. It's a bit of a bitter statement towards the next generation. Saito is unlikable to a fault, and he's supposed to represent the children of now? That sort of becomes a debate about collectivism versus individualism. Saito's actions are defined by more modern sensibilities like rebellion of authority, saving, relying on your wealth, going off to become independent. However, in this story, all those actions lead to his horrific death and more. It could have all been avoided if he just followed the rules, done what the collective had told him, and that's a bit of a damning statement. You know, telling their kids that they were victims of war to guilt them without that wider context, and after all, it was not that younger generation that let their pride get the best of them while causing mass suffering because of their unwillingness to back down. The narrative of Japanese victimhood has become a sort of unfortunate staple of these sort of Japanese war films. While not unwarranted as a stance, it can be used a lot as a diversion tactic to present more devious messages. What I'm trying to say overall is that you shouldn't throw stones at glass houses. I don't think Takahata was intending to be cruel or malicious with his directorial decisions. As stated, Grave does more to criticise the indifference of war and how people can end up siding with tyranny because of it. But it seems the main objective of the film was to push a political agenda, which again, nothing wrong with, art is political and always has been. While Takahata may not see Grave as an anti-war film, I do believe he's using the imagery presented to create a negative connotation with war targeted at the youth, to keep that idea of the Article 9 bill in the consciousness of adolescents growing up. Using a character like Setsuko as that linchpin, Grave of the Fireflies at its core is about the victims of war. Their parents are taken from them, their idealistic life is gone, their circumstances outside of their control lead to their slow, painful death. Instead of framing this as an issue of war itself, Takahata wants to personalize it so it will be more emotionally relevant to its audience, adolescents, by using Setsuko as an angelic figure, the ultimate innocent martyr, not too young to be unable to communicate, but not old enough to be independent. The animated version's ending shows the key difference here, in how it frames this. By focusing on the death of Setsuko, giving a montage to her day-to-day life, the film has a setup to make the audience mourn and cry about the death of innocence, while the youth are also going through a similar change, seen further in how they frame the two ghosts over current-day Japan at the end. These techniques are borderline manipulative. Regardless, I understand why they would use them. Takahata himself had a breakdown during the production, unsure how to end the film. The producer had to come to pull him out of that spiral. His choice was to use hard imagery to sell it, and I can't argue it's not effective, even if it isn't to my tastes. But watching two siblings starve is a bitter pill to swallow. Only Yesterday handles itself smoother, even if I do have some problems with its content. It's a distinct and personal tale reflecting on one's life. The flashbacks are presented in a warm, fuzzy, simplified manner to give contrast to the rest of the animation's grounded and lavished world. The animation here is different. They recorded the voice actor's performance as the team wanted to focus on the facial expressions and subtle muscle movements. Perhaps they went too far with it. At times the characters do look too old or uncanny, but that's not something you'll find in the flashbacks. They're relatable in painful ways. They reminisce on the mundane moments of the past, like that time you remembered something from 10 years ago and you shuddered out of embarrassment. It's about growing up and thinking how life could have gone, feeling unsatisfied now, longing for a change in routine. And that's what Taiko does when she takes a vacation to the countryside. Although it might be too good to be true, as the major conflict of the film rests on her decision. This is the part I take fault with, to a degree. Glorifying the peaceful farmer life as the best way to live, a satisfying life, instead of that nasty, nasty city life. Ugh, gross. It seems a bit naive as a take for a 27-year-old woman. I mean, I live next to the countryside and it ain't the be-all end-all, I can tell you that much. Granted, I will give the film credit, they do address this towards the end, where Taiko realizes she's been playing dress-up the whole time, and making a life-changing decision off a 10-day break, that might be a bit silly, especially when it's fueled by nostalgia. I mean, at least without any retrospective. After all, this narrative is fabricated. The original source material was only the flashbacks. These scenes are the most striking part of the film, for sure. Isao thought it would be hard to weave those vignettes into a full film without having something to encompass it, hence Taiko's decision. Now that decision in the end is a little too sentimental for my tastes, but overall I still think it's a great film. One of Isao's best, and a lot of that comes from the quality of his intimate storytelling that tackles some of the more taboo stuff about growing up. Pom Poko, his most divisive film yet. It's one of the few films by Takahata which is not an adaptation. It seems the East has a better opinion of it. Japan Times put it down as an essential viewing for the director. And so it should be, it's a lot of fun. It's a wild ride full of absurd humour. It's a film that is direct on its environmental message without becoming Captain Planet. It has a less idealistic tone throughout, pushing the idea of coexisting and preserving what we have to encourage kids that it's something worth doing, focusing on humanising the animal's plight to make it easier for young kids to understand the conflict they face. Some could argue it also becomes a bit about eco-terrorism, but Isao has always been adamant that the Tanukis were only working in self-defense to save their homes, doing all they could, but in the end it wasn't enough. Pom Poko is bloody weird and Japanese to the bone. I'm surprised they put such a budget behind something they knew would not do well outside of Japan. But that's Isao in a nutshell. He doesn't care, and he will make what he makes. Not to mention, Pom Poko also reinforces what a great comedic talent Takahata was. Just like in My Neighbor Yamada, Kondo was a key animator on many previous Takahata projects, and a good friend to the studio. Being the first outside the original pair to direct a Ghibli feature, his sudden death in 1998 left a hole in the studio that almost left Miyazaki to retire. Did Kondo's passing lead to such a distinct change in art direction on Takahata's next project? It seems Cell Animation had lost its luster to him. The director became interested in new techniques, going for a small scale in comparison to that prior film, a left-field choice of adapting a manga known as Nono-chan, which became the film My Neighbor Yamada. Its visual style has this dreamlike abstraction. Yamada is light-hearted in its comedy, and it has all these small vignettes that are tied together. This time there's no need of some overarching story. We can see Takahata's projection from Only Yesterday towards a more flowing, abstract visual language. The film may not look like anything special at first, yet it variates to do things that it wouldn't be possible to do if the style wasn't so simplified. Yamada was a necessary stepping stone for Takahata. The production sent Ghibli into chaos though, as they had no way to set up such a schedule, leading to higher costs with a distinct anti-Ghibli look, which didn't go down well at the box office. Takahata was content to stop after Yamada, yet the producer Nishimura spent 18 months with Takahata day to day trying to convince him to make one last picture. And Takahata was like, okay, you got me. This became Princess Kaguya, based on one of the oldest Japanese tales in history. Isao's last film is one of his most beautiful, taking full advantage of the Yamada's visual language, next to something we've seen him tackle before, like in his short for Winter Days, a move towards abstraction and sumai painting. To do this, they created backgrounds that took on a minimalist design with watercolours, which came with a new set of problems in that you have to try and keep the consistency between shots. Instead of cleaning up the animation, they tried to capture that raw quality seen in the storyboards. Emotions rule the aesthetic, then digital techniques are brought in to sort of place it all together. The whole process had no fixed colour palette. It was decided on the fly like an absolute madman. All these little decisions added up, leading to an 8-year production, which goes to show in its expressive animation, although it did take a great strain on the team. The storyboards weren't even completed until a year before it was released, and it doesn't help it has the longest runtime of any of his films. As a final film, it's thematically fitting. The early side of the film is somewhat reminiscent of Heidi, where other bits might echo the sort of sad story of Grave, and some of the growing up sequences feel a bit like Only Yesterday. I can even feel the rhythm and the celloist coming out in certain parts. Because it's his last outing, it seems to thematically resonate with everything that he'd done beforehand, covering dense topics in the process, like losing one's agency in a hierarchy of class, how that material world cannot bring you happiness in the end, and the burden of being a princess who is basically treated like a political tool in a patriarchal system, thrown into an arranged marriage. That could hit harder with Japanese audiences too, because arranged marriage was common in Japan until the end of the Pacific War. Even now there is a small portion that still occur. Finally, a somewhat Buddhist outlook of it all, how in the end, to reach enlightenment and her own people, the princess must give up her worldly perceptions and let go of everything, including her love and attachment. And as Jana Moji brought up in her article, there's a Japanese saying that even a frog's baby is still a frog, no matter the appearance. Kaguya was not meant to live as a bamboo cutter's daughter, and that is a dense narrative to sort of unpack. With that, it could have been a little bit more to the point at times, yes, I agree, but it's worth it in the end. Despite gaining Isao's highest gross, the long production cycle meant the film didn't break even. Like they say, poetry, it rhymes. So that's it for Isao. His career is mired by flat notes with commercial audiences. However, that artistic work speaks for itself. Some may have called him the greatest anime director of all time. His topics are wider than Miyazaki in genre, but in some ways they're just as tightly knit, with his projects focusing on family, culture, and respect for nature while finding your way through the trials of growing up. Takahata's work brought a needed variety to Ghibli's output, which without it the company might not have had such a glowing reputation as burnout seeped in. He's a master craftsman, and if you were looking for a place to start, here's a couple of my favourites. I'll leave the chart in the description. So next time you want to watch the same Ghibli film for the 50th time, give my man Takahata a go instead. He deserves it. Hey, thanks for watching. This is a redub of a video that was blocked worldwide. I hope you enjoyed the slightly newer version and the much better audio. Thank you for the patrons. If you enjoyed this video, you can give it a like, you can click the bell, or you can support me on Patreon too if you really liked it. I should be revamping that whole stuff real soon. Anyway, have a nice day, have a nice time, and we'll see you next time, baby.